Here we go. Now, so what I'm good. I tried to send the recording, and I screwed up the recording in lab, so I'm not too worried about that because it wasn't anything really major. But I'm trying to send that recording, and I'm doing this YouTube thing, and I have to make them available. So I'm trying to get that sorted out. So any of these recordings from the lecture are coming. Give me a break, and I'll probably address that at home tomorrow. It's easier for me, because I have too much stuff to do here, particularly during the first week. But I will get those on so you can listen to them again. So that's the first nugget. And we do have sound, so I can play that animation and get back to what we were doing. So if anybody wasn't here for the first go round, I'll have that lecture and find a way to get that. Usually I can just copy and paste your names, and it was giving me all sorts of grief trying to do that. And I have no idea why. But, what am I going to tell you? So hopefully I'll be able to change that and add them directly to Blackboard. Because I had a couple of students tell me they couldn't access them because I put them on private rather than public. And because I thought there was copyright issues that were there. But nevertheless, that's all. So we're going back to our basic cell. And I did want to play that animation. That's where you heard the sound before with that one PowerPoint. And this is 3B, as you recall. And I realize we've done all this, but I mean, rather than me narrating it, whenever we have these views that show these kinds of animations, I find them to be very valuable. Because I think they do a very good job with those, particularly when we start to see with nerve and muscle physiology, which this is the lead into. So we'll start there. And again, you'll find this you have the PowerPoint on your Blackboard.
The human brain alone contains about 100 billion nerve cells, called neurons. A neuron, like every other cell, has positively and negatively charged ions inside and outside. Further, a resting neuron has a greater negative charge on the inside surface of the plasma membrane and a greater positive charge on the outside surface. This partitioning of charge creates a voltage difference across the membrane known as the resting membrane potential, which can be measured using a voltmeter. On average, an intracellular electrode records a value of minus 70 millivolts. The resting membrane potential depends on two factors. First, it depends on the presence of sodium and potassium gradients across the plasma membrane. Specifically, there are more sodium ions outside the neuron than inside, and more potassium ions inside the neuron than outside. Second, the resting membrane potential depends on the differential permeability of the plasma membrane to sodium and potassium ions. Leak channels in the plasma membrane allow sodium and potassium ions to diffuse or leak down their concentration gradients. The membrane contains many more potassium leak channels than sodium leak channels. Thus, the membrane is much more permeable, or leaky, to potassium ions. As positively charged potassium ions leak out of the neuron, the inside surface of the membrane becomes negatively charged compared to the outside surface. If potassium was the only ion moving, the potential would stabilize at minus 90 millivolts. However, positively charged sodium ions leak into the neuron, which slightly offsets the negative charge and raises the voltmeter reading to minus 70 millivolts. Sodium-potassium pumps actively transport sodium ions out of the neuron and potassium ions back in, compensating for the sodium and potassium leaks. Thus, the pumps help to maintain the resting membrane potential.
So what that all was really was not just the creation of the resting membrane potential, but the really important role of the sodium potassium pumps and why they're being used constantly. Because every cell in your body effectively is undergoing that leakiness almost continuously. And that'll be a consistent finding that we see. What we're going to see is the electrical events, okay, certainly we get to muscle activity precede mechanical events. And here you're going to see electrical events, then chemical events, then mechanical events. So these are all parts of sort of the background. And that's why we're doing the cell first, because you surely had much of this before. And it's just really just I'm trying to hit points of emphasis. And yes, we touched on the idea of secondary. So you're using a force, you might as well benefit maximally by using your ATP. So in the process of doing this, we can create concentration gradients. We can create electrical gradients, like the chemiosmotic force that we see in proton motive force, those chemiosmotic events. So we can bring things in by co-transport or anti-transport, which brings us kind of where we left off. And we do a lot of business this way in human physiology with vesicular transport. It expends a lot of energy because you're going to have energy to trigger the opening and closing of the membrane and the enveloping of things, whether you're ingesting them or you're expelling them. And so really we boil this down into endocytosis and exocytosis. So far, if we look at the passive modes, simple diffusion really mirrors what goes on in your lungs. Oxygen and carbon dioxide rapidly exchanging through the membrane based on their concentration gradient. Effectively facilitated diffusion is glucose. Even though it's indirect, it's insulin creating a chain reaction, but facilitating the movement of glucose in by already pre-existing channels. Really sort of, if you will, unlocking those channels in an indirect way. And we're going to see yet another way that active transport when we get to something called receptor-mediated endocytosis, which is very, very important, particularly from a medical standpoint, that are there. So to make this, so if we're going to move yards, open and close membrane, and move a bunch of stuff in, we got to use ATP. So you have endo and endo coming, incoming, exocytosis, outcoming. So on the endocytosis front, we have phagocytosis, which implies solid, penocytosis, which implies liquid or oils, and something that's a little bit unique involving something outside the cell contacting receptors and creating the impetus to allow the ATP, then in concert with the ATP, allowing something very specific to go into the cell. Why that's important, that's one of the major ways that certain kinds of lipoproteins enter. So as you get older, if you have older relatives, an inordinately large amount of people, you reach a certain age, they insist on putting you on cholesterol medicines, okay, which I happen to reject because they gave me a pretty bad headache. But nevertheless, a lot of people have cholesterol problems or lipid-related problems, let's call it that, based on diet or lack of exercise and or both. But some, it's hereditary. And the hereditary lipidemias, people having excessive amount of lipid and lipid products in their bloodstream, have a lot to do with the absence of these receptors. That's why this is so important. And these are folks who are benefited greatly by utilizing medications. There's been a lot of problems with the medications over the years. They haven't all been a panacea because early on they put a large amount of strain on people's liver that were there. So, and that was troubling. But the reason, if you wonder why, if you have most of your grandparents, unfortunately, are my age, I know, don't start. Just don't start. Oh, my gramps is only 60. I remember going to my physician's office. He's now retired. He was younger than I am. And he gets out his phone. He starts doing. We must have a program in it. He goes, if you take cholesterol medicine, you have a 22% less likelihood of having a heart attack or a stroke. So here, take this. It's like, oh, great, thanks. But I refused. So that's the exocytosis, transporting it out. Transcytosis is a little bit different. You see that a lot digestively. Things are just moving through the cells, but not being impacted by activity vis-a-vis what happens inside with most endocytic activity, where we have lysosomes and phagolysosomes, which you'll see shortly, which is a really important review. And obviously transporting from one organelle to another, that's this idea of vesicular trafficking. Because what do we do with important products inside the cell? The cytoplasm is a hostile environment. That's why we use membrane containers, whether from inside to outside or within the context of the cell. Is that a question?
Yeah.
Go for it.
Why is transcytosis like a thing?
Digestively, you'll see that.
Okay.
You'll see that when we get into certain areas, transcytosis, and a little bit in urinary as well. The particles are just being brought back in, but not acted on. They'll travel through, so they don't have that endolysosome, that phagolysosome form. Sure. Hey, I knew the answer to that one. Believe me, I'm coming to school. You guys are, again, I'm punishing my tongue, are smart. Okay? You know when somebody's BSing you. So I'm one of those who says, I don't know. Because there's nothing wrong with saying I don't know. You can't effing know everything, despite what you think. Okay? So if you lose credibility, because you know if somebody gets up there and starts to BS you, you're going to walk out of the room and go, oh, that professor is talking through his anal orifice. I would have said talking to his ass, but that's impolite in class. Oh, never mind. So endocytosis, protein-coated vesicles, they're all coated with protein. Typically receptors, that's the selectivity, but not always. Hijacking. Pathogens do this all the time. Okay? You can look up the instances. There's a lot of things. Maybe the most notorious is sort of like a false flag where HIV bonds to certain kinds of macrophages and helper T cells. Okay? And it induces this. And then it's brought in. So this mechanism you'll see, and I'll give you some example. And so if it's not transcytosis, it's going to fuse with the lysosome, making that endolysosome or phagolysosome. And basically, what does the lysosome do? It releases its contents. It either facilitates digestion and utilization, or if it's a bad guy, hopefully breaks it down and destroys it and gets rid of the mess. That's just, and they go through all these slides, and you've seen them. So we have so much to do. I don't go crazy because you can click through this as easily as I can click through it. So as you can see, whether once effectively they detach those coding proteins, now it can fuse. It can undergo whatever reaction is necessary. You can get rid of it. If it's transcytosis, again, it's just going through. So it derives its name from cell eating, and phago for eating, cytosis for that. And then the whole idea, and it's how the pseudopods form, whether it's from receptors or just alterations of certain substances coming in close contact with various kinds of receptor proteins, whether they're generic or specific. And then, it forms that, it kind of like, I love that. Usually I have something, it's coming along, it can swallow something up. I love that. Sort of, it comes along, it brings it inside. To me, that's like embracing your food. As you all know, I have an existential relationship with food. I eat, therefore I am. What fun are you? Okay. So amoeboid motion, there you can see the pseudopods, false feet, coming around, okay, engulfing it. Penocytosis, fluid phase materials, fine. Environmental sampling all the time, a lot because they're mostly in the fluid or oil phase when you get into the small intestine, when we get into GI, and membrane is always conserved. So the membrane components eventually by things that are being exocytosed, the membrane is restored. So it's not like, when you're having dinner, your cells are shrinking because they're constantly undergoing some kind of exocytosis. Receptor-mediated, These are more specific. These are clathrin-coated pits. So this is the example of the LDLs, which are really the problematic lipoproteins that if they're not brought in and worked on and metabolized appropriately, they cause a greater amounts of problems. That's the whole basis for what was developed in 1980 or published in 1980, which was where you fractionate those. And as you get older, you do this all the time that are there. Okay. So the University of Massachusetts study, that's very, very good, called the Framingham study, if you're familiar with it. And that's where you used to get the HDLs and the LDLs and create the ratio. And when you reach a certain age, then you have to fast overnight and they're able to do these. And I do this typically about once a year. And the interesting thing about that, just to complete the thought, and we do it in cardio as well. Really, it's a ratio between between LDLs, which are always more abundant, and HDLs. So it's like a ratio with the LDLs being the numerator and the HDLs being the denominator. So how do you reduce the fraction? Because basically, the higher the ratio, the more likely you are to have a cardiovascular event. Well, you can reduce the numerator. It's a lot easier to increase the denominator because it works faster. How does that work? Exercise. Exercise, exercise, exercise. Or as my wife says, get my corpulent posterior to the gym. Again, because she wouldn't say, because she always tells me another way. Get your fat ass. Just saying. Notice what else comes in this way. Iron, good. Insulin, good. Unfortunately, viruses, diphtheria, toxins from cholera, bad. Caveolae are a little bit different. We're going to see them when we do the muscle unit. Okay? So when we do that, you're going to see with smooth muscles, they have smaller pits with a different protein coat from clathrin. And as you can see, unfortunately, vis-a-vis tetanus toxin, that's a problem. Okay? So we'll take a look at those other pits that are there. Exocytosis, expelling it, activated by cell surface signals or changes in membrane voltage, which we're talking about before. Secretory vesicle, very famously, I'm sure in some like you did the snare protein thing, right? V snares and T snares. Thank you. Okay. So what interferes with that? What's the famous agent that's used to selectively interfere with snare proteins at the neuromuscular junction? Or we do it like a Jeopardy question. Yeah, they use different tune. I used the tune that was from the original game show like that called You Bet Your Life. But I digress. Once again, Botox. That's how Botox works. They use micro amounts of botulism toxin that's refined, and they inject it because for about 6 months it blocks V snare and T snares coming together to exocytose acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter that's involved in the neuromuscular junction. So I have to get my wrinkles taken care of. Don't take this away. You look fine the way it is. You look great.
We should all get it.
Yeah.
Botox? Do you think there's like a Groupon for that?
Yeah, we should probably all get it. Get rid of these like.
I feel like we could all use it.
Oh, come on.
We're all bio majors.
I mean, having worked on the late Joan Rivers, I mean, she couldn't move her face.
It's worth it.
She had so much plastic surgery, she couldn't move it. Talk about a permanent smile. And she played Dot Matrix. It was my favorite movie. Spaceballs, the movie. Moving on. So, exocytosis, hormones, neurotransmitters, which we're going to spend a lot of time with, mucus, cellular waste, etc. There it is, spitting that stuff out. There's the snare proteins. As you can see, the vesicular snare proteins, the transport snare proteins, they snare together, as you can see, and that's where the impact is for that. All said and done, see you later. Resting membrane potential, every single cell a limited number of cells, read that as nerve and muscle cells, have the capability of rapidly altering that membrane potential, that resting membrane potential, to create a wave of electrical activity that will open channels selectively. And that's where we're going to get into the concept of voltage-gated channels and the ability to transmit electrically that signal from point A to point B, wherever point B is, depending on what it is. So this is all the physics, and as you all know, and if you don't, I don't do physics. Don't do physics, I don't do plants, okay, I don't do teeth.
Thank God for you.
So we have a plant guy. Okay. I wouldn't know a monocot from a dicot. So I just don't. The only plant I had a tacit amount of familiarity with back 53 years ago was one that my friends used to grow in their dorm rooms. Long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. No, we did shrooms, but we didn't grow them.
They ever get caught?
Do you have any stories?
Yeah, we did not have. No, we fortunately stayed out of legal entanglements.
Good job.
Good
Yeah,
job.
I missed it.
But but when you guys want to go someplace, all my students go someplace on spring break. We used to put a poster up and take a pill. We would go anywhere on spring break.
You're on the moon.
That was, oh yeah, you could go to the dark side of the moon easy. Just put up that very famous album cover.
You had a better trip than anyone else.
Yeah. Spring break, where you going? Wherever I want, baby. Very strange. It was a very, very strange environment. I matriculated in college immediately after Woodstock. So it's just, so you have an idea what was going on in college. Crazy. So polarity, again, this is the potassium, key player, resting membrane potential, offset by proteins that are negatively charged. So the interior is electrically neutral, but areas close to the membrane are not. Again, so you'll see the natures, you saw what the offset was. Potassium is pulled back in, as you saw before. The drive for potassium to leave the cell is balanced by the drive to stay in, and that's the resting membrane potential. So really, the electrochemical gradient, the relationship, and that's why I'll say it again and again, the importance of potassium is really, that's an alarm clock for a physician of monumental proportions. We don't see variations. Variations in sodium are rare, but when they occur, they are so severe. Generally, it's a very poor prognosis. People do not do well. And so this is just reiterating it. The chloride does not influence resting membrane potential. Okay, it's very much balanced, but it's somewhat the offset, and it's on the exterior of the cell. We'll get into chloride a lot when we look at certain neurotransmitters. Those are chloride-gated channels, and the movement of chloride when we get to proton pumps is very significant. Very significant. We're making like hydrochloric acid in the stomach, what they call the chloride shift. That's an important area to get into. And so they're just showing to you the large proteins that cannot leave. And again, the preponderance or the abundance of potassium on this side versus the opposite, and the abundance of sodium, not so much potassium on the outside. And so we did all of those things, and the consistent 3-to-2 relationship. And then lastly, to me, these are important just to review the cell adhesion molecules that are there. Really important. Again, the distinction between, because when we begin to look at individual systems, for instance, let me go over here. So the cell adhesion molecules protruding, anchoring the cell to the extracellular matrix. Again, everything is interconnected. So they're either cells are connected to themselves with lining epithelial cells, or if they're connective tissue cells, the extracellular matrix, the fibers within that connect to cells. So pull and tug affects cells in all different areas, even if they're not next to each other. Movement across. the attraction of white blood cells is also part of it by modifying certain of those surface adhesion molecules, and they're facilitated by chemotactic mechanisms. The release of chemicals from damaged cells pull cells to the area effectively by increasing that chemical concentration. It's really an important force. So and again, that's really what happened in COVID when we began to see a lot of disruption. A lot of those factors that reduced inflammation actually worked opposite and increased inflammation because of both attaching to different receptors and altering receptors. I did a whole presentation on that 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, when we first had the COVID lockdown, which would be March of 20. I don't know what I did with it, but I found some really good research because there's all sorts of stuff, and everything was being done remotely, of course. Stimulating synthesis or degradation of various types of junctions, intracellular signals, all of that. So you have contact. This is another important part. I talked about it a little bit with those cell recognition molecules. Effectively, cells that touch and recognize each other by those recognition molecules. So that's both part of normal development, that first 6 months, and for many of you take immunology, you're going to hear a lot about this. And your body recognizing self versus non-self, and very much what your immune system does when anything that can be construed, whether rightly or wrongly, as foreign. And I do quite a bit of unit because we touched on it a little bit when we did arthritis and bone and joint type of stuff about autoimmune phenomena. Because effectively I have an immunologically based kind of arthritis, but thankfully controlled. Okay? So the other thing with contact is contact inhibition. Cells normally just form a layer. And what does that is when they're surrounded and contacting with other cells, the stimuli for growth is retarded. So they stop growing or growing excessively unless a gap develops. They grow some more. So we see this in cell cultures in a laboratory. We don't see heaped up cells, but in cancerous cells, they lose that. And they begin to heap up, and that's one of the ways we're able to look at when you do a biopsy, or even when you're doing it clinically and looking at an area of growth, but you can see something that looks like it's growing irregularly or invasively versus something that appears to be well encapsulated, having a distinct boundary between affected and unaffected tissue. That's typically something you see in benign tumor formation. I can't tell you how many lesions I biopsied, in an effort to find it. So what you have to do when you biopsy, I think I left my marker in the other room. No, I didn't. We do something like this. Here's the lesions, a freckle, something that shouldn't be there. It looks like it might or may not be irregular. You do what's called an elliptical incision. So you want to take out a certain amount of what appears to be healthy tissue on the perimeter, because it's at that interface where the changes are best visualized microscopically in the laboratory. So he ellipse that out, and so then you'd be left effectively with a gap, and you could stitch it up. Now, a lot of times in dermatology, we use punch biopsies. They're small enough to just be a little circle to one stitcher. Just numb it and pop it. That's it. Boom. Happy dance. Send the bill into insurance. The good old days. I had an Audi and a Saab rather than a 2012 Subaru with 240,000 miles. I should have been a lawyer. That's why my 80-year-old brother-in-law, he had a Lotus, he had a variety of Porsches. It's just awful. He had a great English sports car called a Morgan with running boards. Oh my God, we stopped and looked at that. Oh, it's okay. So, chemical signaling, that's the one we're spending a lot of time with, everybody. Whether binding triggers enzyme activation, opening channels, we're going to look at all of that. The difference between ligands, which are chemical signaling, versus changes in the membrane potential voltage signaling, what's allowed to pass, etc. So when we have ligand or ligand-gated channels, that's when that bonds. Let's just take insulin, for example, shape change, activation, etc. So it depends. And you're going to see this has a lot to do when you have a chemical that bonds that activates ion channels and it allows charged particles. The response is very quick. When it indirectly, when it just alters various types of chemical changes inside, it's slower. And you'll see that neurologically, a lot of the rapid responses, and we'll get into this down the road, have to do with the activation of ion channels. Why we can do a muscle very quickly, because we're activating, acetylcholine is activating, opening ion channels and creating this, what we call an action potential relatively rapidly, rather than a subtle change altering the chemical world, which takes long. And longer doesn't mean long. It means not fractions of a second. It may be seconds, minutes, hours, days, etc. I'm not going to do the G protein receptor. How many times have you done that already? A lot? Yes?
Yeah.
Too many times? Good. So G protein versus cholesterol-based fatty type signaling, lipid-based protein signaling. Okay. So we're not going to, I love this. The little guy's running. And so effectively, just to summarize, G proteins, because it utilizes GTP and GDP, guanosine system versus adenine systems, still similar in many ways to ATP signaling by using the movement of the activated phosphate and then carrying it on to some type of an effector protein. And we'll look at this in a variety of things. The chain reaction then typically occurs by activating kinase enzymes, so you can have multiple activities inside the cell. That in insulin, you'll find is tyrosine kinase is what occurs. And they go through that whole series of little slide things, but you don't want to do. Okay, almost, let me see what time it is. Got time. I can get through this and I can dedicate Friday to the cell cycle. Aren't you excited? I love the cell cycle.
Really?
Yeah, PMAT. Prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. PMAT. That's what we used to call my wife's name is Patty, so we called her mom P-Mom. And that came PMAT. It was like in the days when we had P. Diddy. That's like Pope Francis. You know, Frankie Red Shoes at Yahoo. You can't see him doing that. He used to ride a motorcycle. He had a T-shirt. If you can read this, on the back of the T-shirt, if you can read this, the nun fell off. What?
What?
The Pope. He used to ride a motorcycle in Argentina.
Did he actually?
He did.
How do you know that?
He was there.
Jewish people love love church stuff. I mean, the best show on TV right now,
Crazy.
the best show on TV is called The Chosen. None of you have seen that. And I'm not doing this from a religious basis. It is absolutely a brilliant series that anybody can watch. It's crowdfunded. It is absolutely, it's all about the life of Jesus. It's appointment TV for my wife and I every time they drop a new episode. We absolutely love it. It's great.
Don't you like Yellowstone?
Oh yeah. From a standpoint of that, Yellowstone, 1923, 1883, all these Taylor Sheridan ones.
I'm trying to get into it. Which one's the best?
Yeah, Yellowstone's probably the best place to start. Yellowstone's absolutely fabulous. Oh my God. Moving on. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to review extraordinarily quickly parts of the cell. Are you ready? Parts of the cell: cytoplasm, stuff that's in there, inclusion bodies, organelles. I know it's organelles. Okay? So cytoplasm, as interesting as anything, sol-gel properties. And that's the beauty of it. It's not purely liquid, so there are areas where things flow, and some flow better than others. A variety of inclusion bodies, and certainly the organelles. for your purposes, know the distinction, as you already do, between membrane and non-membrane bound organelles. To me, the ribosome is interesting because it only becomes membrane bound when it has one of those markers on it that you learn about in cell molecular that creates the bound ribosome. Where it targets it so it attaches itself and to the endoplasmic reticulum at quote unquote rough endoplasmic reticulum. So that's of note. So I think those, just a quick review of all those. We all know about the mitochondria. Okay. To me, the most interesting thing about it is the fact that, and you had this undoubtedly, you all had endosymbiotic theory in micro, the idea that prokaryotic cells were engulfed but not completely phagocytized. So you ended up with effectively within whether it's the chloroplast in a plant or the mitochondria in both the plant and in our cells, you have single circular DNA, prokaryotic DNA, 70S ribosomes, prokaryotic ribosomes within there. So there's a lot of good evidence to support that with regard to the structure and the nature of it from a standpoint scientifically. That's interesting. The other thing is we begin to see this thing that I emphasize all the time, the folds, this using of folding membrane, folding proteins in such a way to increase surface area. That's what the body does better than anything else. We did the brain thing with all that folding, all the sulci and the gyri. That's what we do. We have to put a lot of surface area in a small space. We did it in the digestive tract, alimentary canal. Okay, how they replicate, binary fission, not mitosis or meiosis, prokaryotic replication that are there. Their own DNA, so we can make more when we need them, and when we don't need them, they disappear. So I'll store it. You're going to start going out of the gym and working out, you're going to make more mitochondria in your muscles. All of a sudden you stop, you're injured, whatever, it goes away. Like me, you're sitting on your corpulent posterior watching unlimited games. Not a really great national final in the NCAA football. Which is why somebody came up with a great stat. I think it was Chris Sims. He goes, there's like 60, notwithstanding Patrick Mahomes, there's like 60 people 60 pros that come from the Big 12, and there's like 500 each from the Big 10 and the SEC. Why are you picking a Big 12 team? It's just not going to work. Not going to work. Moving on. So you can see all that, the cristae, the folds, the anatomy that's there. Fine. Free versus membrane bound ribosomes. Again, based on the markers that are there, whatever the name of that is, I always forget, that causes it to be attached, that are there. And so what happens? The whole idea, there's only 3 different targets that they will get to for membrane-bound ribosomes. Okay? So where are those proteins going to go? They're either proteins that are going to be contained in a vesicle that's going to stay inside the cell like a lysosome or peroxisome. They're going to be a protein like insulin is going to be expelled, or they're proteins that are going to become membrane incorporated proteins, either in a vesicle or some other structure or in the cell membrane itself. Those are its 3 target locations. So and obviously they're coded for that. And then we continue on. And to me, the endoplasmic, the endomembrane system, starting with the exit way of the nuclear membrane throughout, is really a series of membrane-bound structures that protect whatever is being produced, be it RNA, whether it is proteins that are produced in the smooth, or beg your pardon, in the rough endoplasmic reticulum, your basically membrane protects them from the harsh interior of the cell, which has eddies and currents and acids and alkalis and a variety of chemicals. That's what it does. So it's just it's a protective coat, if you will, that's continuous in nature, and you've seen those all before. Synthesis, proteins, again, cisterns are something that we see continuously. Those folds and this little sort of cul-de-sac area are referred to as cisterns. They're more abundant in the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, and you will see as we get into muscle physiology how important they are because calcium is stored. When you see cells that have an abundance of smooth endoplasmic reticulum, that's lipid related. Detoxification, lipid synthesis, lipid activities, calcium storage, those are the big players that come in that area. So lipid metabolism, cholesterol and steroid-based hormone synthesis. And again, when we get into how steroid hormones traverse, remember they move a little bit differently. They can pass through the membrane. They target cytoplasmic receptors. Then that rather than complexing on the exterior, like a G protein, they complex on the interior within the cytoplasm, and then they're able to enter into the nucleus and directly affect transcription and then translation. So detoxification. So when we see a liver cell, which has a much greater proportion of smooth endoplasmic reticulum, we reason accurately that the liver is the major area for, you have three areas where you detoxify your body. Liver is number one. Lungs more for expelling stuff, kidneys more for expelling. So some products we're able to expel because they're soluble in plasma in a gaseous state and we can expel them. Most of what we excrete from the kidney are products that the liver and other organs have made more water soluble that we can expel in the urine, and then it's up to the liver to do everything else. The liver is an underestimated organ in regard to its importance. So this is not a temperance lecture not to drink. It's like anything else. You have to do moderation is important for all of those things. Glycogen to free glucose, and then the calcium storage activities. The Golgi packing and shipping department, my analogy, you've already done the cis and trans stuff. Love that. And then the three pathways for the secretory vesicles, whether they're exocytosis, whether they're going to fuse with the membrane, or whether they're going to be lysosomes or peroxisomes. Voila, that are there. To me, it's an important point. So lysosomes, digestion and defense, because those are, anything that we ingest is going to go in there. What does the peroxisome do? Similar function, much more, to me, much more defensive in nature than digestive. Because its whole job, okay, free radicals, toxic derivatives of oxygen. What do they contain? An abundance of enzymes, principally two. What are the two? You had micro. What test did you do? Did you do the bubble test? That's one. That's how we distinguish between staph and strep. One has catalase, one does not. Our aerobic cells have catalase, so they can break down hydrogen peroxide into its constituents when it's exposed to catalase enzyme, water and oxygen gas. That's why when you put it on a wound, it bubbles. You put peroxide and it hurts. You put it on intact skin, it doesn't do anything. Okay? The other one, SOD, superoxide dismutase. Because the main radical, what's oxygen's job in life? Yeah, but what does it do in cell metabolism? You're all smart. Here's oxygen. I looked it up. Here's O2. It's the terminal electron acceptor. That's what it does. What does it mean? You bombard it with electrons. And people remember what oxygen is. It wants to, I want to gain 2 electrons. Look at the periodic table. So, right, see, I even wrote hydrogen, helium. See, when that's why I haven't put them in, because I write on there. What does it do? It wants to gain a couple of electrons. So normally you would end up with O with 2 minuses, and it combines with the 2 protons, and voila, you and I got water. We know how to get rid of water. Okay. What if urinate functions? Urinate. Periodically, you get this bad boy, the superoxide radical. To convert superoxide radical with an enzyme called superoxide dismutase, without balancing the equation, it turns it in the presence of water, the superoxide radical becomes hydrogen peroxide, also a free radical. Free radicals are the linchpin of modern cancer theory. So that's the whole idea of what they are. Lysosomes, a safe site. I love that. Digesting all the bad guys, non-functional organelles, da-da. And obviously, you might remember from when we did the bone unit that they play an important role vis-a-vis osteoclasts from that and autodigesting or autolysis that are there, lysosomal storage diseases. If you can't get rid of the garbage accumulates in the cell. That's what Tay-Sachs is, very famous. It was one of the earliest, if you did not know, one of the earliest genetic tests. My first wife and I had that in 1980. We were trying to have children. We wanted to make sure that neither one of us were Tay-Sachs carrier, which we were not. Even though we were unable to conceive biologically, it still was one of the, and now they have an abundance of tests that are available. And so, and it's a terrible disease. And the endomembrane system you know about, and not doing that. Cytoskeleton, the components, filaments, the smallest, nice like a string of pearls. You have, and you're going to see that again in muscle when you have globular actins coming together forming fibrous actin. And the beauty of it is they can assemble and disassemble. Intermediate filaments are not, they're insoluble. They're typically tetramers, so it's like braiding. And that's why they're insoluble and why they're really strong. Okay, and then microtubules, which can basically assemble and disassemble, except they're hollow and they're the widest, if you will. And so you have all of that, the different ways they are, underpinnings, the whole suspension bridge analogy that's there. There's the typical F-actin or fibrous actin. The individual units are called globular actin. The tetramers, you have guy wires, plaques, all that stuff. And playing a role in keratinization. Because when we braid things, we make them stronger. We used to do that all the time in surgery. Take monofilament steel wire, braid it, and make braided steel wire. And then use that to basically sew bones together. See, I actually did that. I know you don't believe me. And these are made out of tubulin rather than actin from the centrosome, and the whole idea of that. And, they become tracks or passageways to motor proteins. You see the assembly, centrioles almost done. The 9+2 configuration and the 9-3, the 9-0 configuration, at the spindle level. Here's the 9-0 because there's not 2 in the middle. The 9 triplets, sort of a pinwheel. Voila. And then the 9+2 that you see in cilia, flagella, but not microvilli. They have the actin filaments in them. And then the whole 9+2, blah, 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 blah. Then the 9+2 and DNA are both important evolutionarily because when you get, a flagellated protozoan, it has a 9+2 configuration in its flagella and it has a 9+0 in whatever its basal body is. And they show you the picture for that. Microvilli, we looked at a little bit in the GI tract. And again, it's all about surface area. And we'll end here at the nucleus. All right, I'm tired. Talk for 3 hours, nonstop.